Now I am speaking as a chair, co-chair for this session. And it is my privilege, one of my colleagues, Mr. Thierry Schneider. He is Vice Director of CEPN, Nuclear Protection Evaluation Center in France, and he is President of SFRP, French Society for Radiological Protection, and also he is also President of the NERIS, European Platform on Emergency and Post-Accident Preparedness and Management, and also importantly, most importantly, he is a member of TG94. So Thierry, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I have a cold. I hope that my voice will allow you to listen and to have the talk sufficiently clear. The aim of my talk will be to focus on tolerability and reasonableness. I will not go too much in detail in theoretical concept. It has already been done. I will try to show you how this has been incorporated or the role which I play in the ICRP since the beginning. It is interesting to notice that in the first publication of ICRP, the question of tolerability and reasonableness have already been mentioned. In the first publication, it is mentioned that it's already stated that faced with the existing uncertainty as a dose-effect relationship for stomatic effect, the Commission referred to keep the dose as low as practicable. And it's also mentioned that due to the fact that we have to use radioactivity, to use radiation, it is concluded that we have to set up some limit so that the risk is not unacceptable and to individual and also to large population. Then, having said that, the key question is how to ground this question of tolerability and acceptability. And it took several decades for the Commission to clarify what's meant as low as practicable and what does it mean not acceptable, and notably to see on which criteria to ground the decision about this intention. So I will first investigate what is behind this question of tolerability, and it has been clearly established already in publication 26 in the 70s that the aim of radiation protection should be to prevent detrimental non-stochastic effect and to limit the probability of stochastic effect to level deemed to be acceptable. And then for non-stochastic effect, the key point for tolerability was to set up some dose equivalent limit at sufficiently low value, as it was mentioned, so that no threshold dose would be reached even following exposure for the whole lifetime. For stochastic effect, you know that it's more complex, and we have large uncertainty and lack of knowledge about what is going on at low dose. So the search for tolerability was mainly the reference to tolerability for the establishment of those limits. And at the beginning, in ICRP 26, the key point which was largely used in the following publication was to set up an annual dose criteria, having in mind the level of tolerable annual risk and the dose risk coefficient, or what has been defined later as the risk, the detriment that we already discussed during this symposium. Then, based on this concept, the first definition, establishment of tolerable level for occupational exposure in publication 26, the Commission used the comparison of risk. And for occupational exposure, to judge the acceptability of the level of risk in radiation work, the reference was used to what was considered as a safer situation in the different occupational activities, mainly only focus on average annual mortality, and then the reference was to have a risk which is not more than 10 minus 4 for this annual dose. And then there was another discussion in publication 26 to really set up the value, the reference value for the dose limit, and it was taken into account the distribution of individual exposure. And the idea with regard to this distribution of individual exposure was to set up a system where the resultant annual average dose equivalent is no greater than 1/10 of the annual limit. And that was based on some feedback of the current occupational exposure at that time, and that led the Commission to adopt an annual dose limit of 50 millisievert for occupational exposure, assuming that this value will result in an average annual exposure of 5 millisievert, and according to the distribution, and which correspond if we use a risk coefficient of 5×10⁻⁵ per year for fatal cancer and 2.5 to 2×10⁻⁵ for hereditary effect, which was in line with the value which have been observed in the literature for comparison of risk. For public exposure, the situation was also in publication 26 to use risk comparison. And from a review of available information related to risk regularly accepted in everyday life, the Commission proposed to have a level of acceptability for fatal risk, which is in the one order of magnitude below the one for occupational risk. And then, based on that, the calculation led to have one value of 1 millisievert per year, but the adoption of the annual limit of 5 millisievert was to consider that once again, in average, due to the distribution of dose, in average, you should be in the range of 0.5 millisievert. So that was the first calculation which were made to use tolerability in order to define dose limit. And then in publication 60, in 2007, the Commission moved to the risk model of tolerability, which have been developed by UK, the Royal Society, and the Health and Safety Executive at the end of the 90s, with reference to 3 levels, which were concerned as unacceptable risk, tolerable risk, and acceptable risk. For unacceptable risk, the key point, as it is mentioned in publication 60 by the Commission, is really to have a risk which is not be acceptable on any reasonable basis in the normal operation. But it is also mentioned that it might have to be accepted in abnormal situation. For tolerable risk, there is a slight difference, which is mentioned that this tolerable risk, of course, is a risk which is not unacceptable, and that it's tolerable, but meaning that they are not welcome, the exposure are not welcome, but can reasonably be tolerated. So you see that within this definition, we already mix the question of tolerability and reasonableness in publication 60 of ICRP. And finally, the acceptable risk is what we will see later on with regard to reasonableness. The question of acceptable is that the risk that can be accepted without further improvement. And so this is the scheme which is well known in publication 60 with level of individual exposure and the articulation between the role of limit on one side and the ALARA level due to the implementation of the optimization principle. Then, for this publication 60, it is interesting to come back on the definition of the limit. In case of worker, the Commission rely on consideration about lifetime dose to justify the value of 20 millisievert. It was no more a strict risk comparison just by calculation, but the Commission referred to a set of practices where, in fact, it was considered as where those or risk were clearly defined as widely regarded as unacceptable. And then based on that, there was a discussion to introduce into the detriment not only the risk calculation, the strict risk calculation in terms of mortality, but also to consider some variation with regard to the length of life loss due to an attributable death, or also the first introduction of incidents of non-concern, although at that time the knowledge were rather limited to do the calculation. In the case of public, the Commission no more refer to risk comparison, but refer to natural exposure to justify the value of 1 millisievert. And the approach was to base the judgment on variation in the existing level of dose from natural sources. And based on that, it was considered that the natural background may not be harmless, but it makes only small contribution to the health detriment. And then it was also considered that it may not be welcome, but the variation from place to place can hardly be called unacceptable. And that was the real rationality to set up the 1 millisievert at that time. Moving to publication 103, then it was a broader view, and the question of limit was less at the central point of the publication 103. It was mainly referring to what we used to call the different band with 1, 20, and 100 millisievert. And the first element was to refer to 100 millisievert with consideration that this is the maximum value for a reference level according to the occurrence of deterministic effect and significant risk of cancer above this value. Then it was clearly mentioned that for the selection of an appropriate value for dose constraint or reference level, there is a need to consider not only risk calculation, but really to consider the relevant exposure situation in terms of the nature of the exposure, the benefit from the exposure situation to individual and society, and the practicability of reducing and preventing the exposure. So we enter for the tolerability in a broader system with publication 103. And then that is a possible adaptation of the tolerability of risk model, which have been used, first introduced in publication 60, and which could be adapted to publication 103, where you have the question of unacceptable or unacceptable, which refer to 100 millisievert, and once again, being able to be considered for exceptional situation. But then you have the range of emerging exposure situation, which could be between 20 and 100, and the existing exposure situation and planned exposure situation between 0 and 20 according to different category of the exposure. Then, based on that, and if you remember the first presentation made by Don Cool on the first day of the symposium, there was a reference to the attitude toward risk and exposure situation. And then the question, the articulation of the tolerable model now in the modern view is to have three types of attitude toward risk. The first one is what we can call quietude or peacefulness, where in fact we consider that we have confidence in the arrangement it put in place and we can live with that. We have the situation where we are not in danger, but we are in a situation of vigilance, and we pay attention, and we organize together to see if there is a need to take further action to reduce the risk. And of course, there is a last situation where we need to react, and we have to act to protect. Based on that, the key point is to say that the tolerability of risk depends on the needs for action from the involved individuals. And then this is a proposal to combine the tolerability of risk model with the attitude toward risk in the ICRP publication 103, and you can recognize the articulation of the model with unacceptable, reaction, vigilance, and quietude and peacefulness, once again, depending on the specific situation, exposure situation, and the nature of exposure. Now, moving to the search for reasonableness, where you have seen that it's clearly articulated with tolerability. We cannot separate it completely, the two concepts. But the search for tolerableness it's interesting to see how it has been implemented in ICRP publication through the optimization principle. And here I just put the table which have been mentioned in publication 101 on optimization, including also publication 103. And you see since the beginning, even before the publication 1, ICRP mentions that the objective is to reduce exposure to the lowest possible level. Then it was mentioned not to reduce, but to keep exposure as low as practicable. The as low as practicable moved to as readily achievable, economic and social consideration being taken into account, which was introduced in publication 9. So that's a long time ago. And then the readily become reasonably achievable. And then the consideration became factors in publication 26. And finally, in publication 103, the social factors became societal factors to embark a broader view on this aspect. So just to briefly review how this has been implemented in ICRP publication, the key point, of course, was the reference in the 70s to the cost-benefit analysis. And in publication 22, it was clearly mentioned that the cost-benefit analysis was to put into comparison the exposure, but including social and economic terms, and to calculate, to transform these terms of exposure into a concept which has been introduced as detriment. And from detriment, the economists were able to propose some monetary value, which were considered in terms of reduction of collective dose and correspond and can be compared directly to the detriment or cost for achieving the reduction. So that was leading to introduce a cost-benefit model with on one curve the cost of protection according to the collective exposure and the cost, the total cost, and on the other term to transform any collective exposure to cost of detriment, including progressively some other terms such as risk aversion to take into account the distribution of risk for high level of exposure. So this is just to show you that all these elements lead to some calculation, and this is a table which have been prepared by ISOE, where you see that notably for the protection of nuclear power plant, a large range of value have been defined. Then it's clear that this economic rationality, and just to make a calculation, was a first dream to really find the optimum level, and just by calculation. And progressively, ICRP tried to introduce and to move from economic rationality to stakeholder involvement progressively. And in ICRP 37, there was the introduction of this famous beta value, and this beta value was considered to take into account what they call non-objective feature and non-health detriment. And the problem is, however, the process to maintain level of exposure as low as reasonably achievable remain essentially a matter of judgment, mixing quantitative and qualitative assessment and field experience. And that's one key point, how to really find this reasonableness and find the optimum level based on the mixing quantitative and qualitative assessment. In ICRP 55, there was the introduction of the ALARA process, and that was also the time where the economists tried to develop and to embark not only risk calculation, but also multi-attribute analysis, discussing the preferences of individual and mixing from economy and social aspect. And finally, in ICRP 101, it was clearly referred to move towards stakeholder involvement. And it's interesting to refer to this paragraph 4 in publication 101, where the basic definition, it's mentioned that the basic definition in publication 60 remain valid for the optimization principle, but now it needs to be relied on a broader process, reflecting the increasing role of individual equity, safety culture, and stakeholder involvement in modern society. So then, of course, what is the role of stakeholder involvement with regard to reasonableness? It's clearly mentioned with regard to stakeholder involvement that reasonableness cannot be defined universally and therefore refer to the specificity of the exposure situation. There is a need to set up some deliberation processes among stakeholders on what is reasonable, but we know that it's not so trivial. And there is also a need to foster the emergence of citizen stakeholders, inform and advise, and this is a reference to the radiation protection culture, which is now introduced in different ICRP publications, allowing the citizen to make and stakeholder to make effective decisions for their own protection and also well-being. It is interesting also to notice that in publication 101, the societal consideration and values were defined as a set of elements, among them equity, ability to control, sustainability, intergenerational consideration, individual benefit, social benefit, level of information and knowledge, and social trust. So this is a large program for the stakeholder involvement. So finally, to conclude, I would like to just give you some few elements of the constituent of reasonableness, which is related to discernment, judgment, common sense, and wisdom. It has already been introduced by Kun-Wo Cho previously. It requires both the understanding of the situation and the reference to knowledge experience. This is a faculty of thinking. This is the decision that cannot be solely driven by theoretical knowledge, but also some qualitative aspect and really the experience and knowledge of people. And this is inseparable from the establishment of deliberative process. Some key points which are related to reasonableness in the literature, this is the importance of what is called the reciprocity. And to set up some discussion, it's quite important that a situation or relationship in which two or more people or groups agree to do something similar for each other are considered. It's also to develop a reasoning accessible to others. And we also refer to all this question of plain language, which have been several times mentioned, to promote fair cooperation. And of course, this is clearly linked to the concept of justice and equity, which have been introduced previously. And finally, reasonableness can be considered as an expression of wisdom, as it was mentioned quite a long time ago by Lauriston Taylor, and that this wisdom could be a basic definition, which is a quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. This is also the disposition to behave and act with the highest degree of adequacy under any given circumstances. And in its popular sense, it's also take reasonable decision and act accordingly. Finally, in concluding my presentation, I just would like that the attempts to find in the 60s and the 90s rational and objective bases for tolerable and reasonable have failed to provide a cut answer. In practice, this is a permanent questioning processes, and the key point is really to find processes in order to act wisely and based on accumulated knowledge and experience. And these processes can be supported by quantitative method and also scientific aspect, but also remain on of a deliberative nature. And of course, as it was mentioned, reasonableness and tolerability are intrinsically related, and I just would like to quote one sentence, one reference to the International Tribunal of Law of the Sea, where it is mentioned that the very multifaceted of the concept of reasonableness should, as relevant, be patently and fully grounded in such synonymous notions as proportionality, balance, fairness, moderateness, consistency, suitability, tolerableness, and absence of excessiveness. Thank you.